I think everybody has a different definition of urban design, and it probably means something different to every person who works within urban design. I don't know what your definition would be, Sarah.
My definition, yeah, you are always. It's a lot. When I would describe it, because even people in the industry, like you say, don't even really quite understand what it is. Even architects, landscape architects, I would say that it's about creating places and spaces for people, and we are dealing with both the built environment and the natural environment, and I guess finding ways of making those come together in the best possible way.
And I think, yeah, to add to that, it's about the spaces between the buildings and how the buildings hang together, but also strategically how we think about landscape and routes and streets and squares and community. But I think actually the more and more that we do our job, the more we realise that our job is actually about communication, and it's about advocacy and trying to take people on the journey. So really, I think we found ourselves to be more like storytellers rather than actually.
That's a nice way of putting it, though.
Yeah, I think we are kind of strategic storytellers.
So of course we care about the detail, and we look at things both at a small scale and large scale. And from what we do at Edge, it is predominantly lots of sort of residential development and working, with the environment to deliver much needed housing, particularly in this country. We do care about the detail, and we want places that ultimately will come forward and will be beautiful places. But the majority of what we're concerned about is the kind of overall spatial planning and making sure that uses function together with each other, that that there's connectivity between existing places, new places, safe places for children to walk, play. So there's not, like an architect, I guess, is so often very much about the detail and exactly how you create even just small elements, how they all come together. We want to make sure that the bigger picture is kind of really kind of nailed and thought about.
And quite honestly, the detail wouldn't be able to come forward if the planning strategy wasn't right, if we weren't looking at things that are in the right place, and if we hadn't nailed that story right from the outset. So I think very much we've become storytellers because that's the way that we've managed to achieve success in what we do. As long as we can tell it right from the outset, then we can follow through with the detail as a project moves forward.
That's a really good way of putting it. It's funny because we talked earlier a bit about the relationship between landscape and urban design, because I often just say the role of landscape architects is to articulate the narrative of other professions, and it's all about that kind of collaborative role. And what you guys do is so similar to that. In principle, it's much the same thing, isn't it? And that's kind of where some of my confusion, because I studied landscape and urban design, and I still don't entirely understand the relationship between and the difference between the two kind of disciplines in a sense. But obviously there is quite a clear distinction, and I think to me it's kind of more scale. Essentially, would you agree? Or?
Yeah, and I do think it probably depends on what background you come from. So, for example, within Edge, we are all designers of sorts, but we've actually all come from very different backgrounds. So my background was originally architecture. Hannah's was architecture and landscape. We have members of the team that have actually come from interior design and sort of public space, sort of exhibition type ideas. So
And fashion.
Oh, really?
So
that's interesting.
we all come with creative minds, and I think that's what's really key about what we do. I think what sets Edge apart from perhaps many other practices that offer urban design is that we are bespokely urban design. So we all have all these professional backgrounds and sort of understanding, and we use that to help us articulate what we do without focusing on it. Whereas I guess I would say our competitors might be architectural practices that offer urban design. So they are very much coming from probably the built form side. You have landscape architects that offer urban design and come therefore from a very landscape sort of driven perspective. And then you have the multidisciplinary practices that might even be more on the engineering side of things. So I think depending on where your passions have come from and where your expertise lies, does change how you therefore approach a project. And I think what we've found in being a bespokely urban design practice and having to generate new clients and get them to really gain an insight and interest in what we do, they have started to recognise how we approach things quite differently.
And yeah, also, I guess we don't come from a planning background
No.
either. So design-led urban design is very different from planning-led urban design, which is often taught at lots of universities. So the beauty of our team is that everybody is design-led, but from a slightly different background. And I think that really makes for proper urban design that really understands a place rather than it doesn't really get under the nitty-gritty, kind of under the surface, which you can find with some planning-led type approaches.
I suppose it can become a bit formulaic, can't
Yeah.
it, when it's more planning-led? Because
Yeah.
it's more zoning, I suppose, isn't it? Whereas you guys are probably a bit more detailed than that, but not as detailed as perhaps architects and landscape architects might be. So you kind of have like a really good middle ground sort of between the two to sort of think about it a bit more holistically, maybe.
I think what's really important, and I think we're learning more and more about what we do, is that actually our role in any project, regardless of scale, whether it's, you know, a very small cluster of new houses through right to sort of new settlements that we're designing, we have to have, and we are having to learn continually about everything. I think a lot of the disciplines we work with, because clearly we have to work with lots of technical kind of disciplines such as flooding experts, highways engineers, ecologists, landscape architects, heritage, archaeology consultants. So clearly we're not experts in all those fields, but we have to understand that they all influence what we ultimately output, because not only do we want to do something creative that fits within the planning system, or might be trying to test the planning system a little bit as well to be a bit more forward thinking, we are also very much grounded in the reality and the viability of and being robust and be able to deliver something going forward.
And I think as part of that, though, we also have to be prepared to challenge our colleagues that we collaborate with if we think there potentially is another way of doing something, or ask the question of, well, that's great that that's the technical solution. However, could we try this? Would this work?
But I think that's because they are very silo in the way that they work, whereas we can't be.
Well, no, we have to think strategically. So being able to see that strategic picture and kind of balance out and spin all the plates for the consultant team gives us the ability to have that holistic approach towards design and creating places, which I don't think necessarily all other disciplines would be able to kind of deal with from that point of view.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's, the siloed issue. I think that's why landscape and urban design is kind of, and you get terms like landscape urbanism and things like that, where it's kind of more kind of joined together as a specific thing, opposed to the two separate kind of professions. And again, I still do see a lot of similarities between the two of them. I mean, because a lot of what we get involved with is, we don't do much master planning in our practice, but we do a lot of various landscape schemes of varying sizes, and quite often we'll find that an engineer will be involved and they will give you the solution to the flooding issue, which may not chime with the rest of the layout or doesn't really fit in with the landscape or whatever. And then you have the architects come in and they'll say, well, this is where the buildings are going. And actually I think part of what people are starting to realise and why it's sort of shifting to this more sort of landscape and urban design focused kind of solutions is that we know that we need to sort of look at a site totally differently and go, what's there now and how do we work with what's there at the minute, and how do we enhance that, and then where does all the infrastructure and the buildings and things like that go?
I think it actually goes a step further, and that's where we would come in. Where has that place been in the past, and therefore where is it now? And then the next therefore being, how should it be shaped in the future? Knowing all of that background, that's something that we tend to work into a lot with our work.
Yeah, we really try to understand the history of a place, the local character, and be that down to the kind of the urban grain, like how has this place grown over time, the street formations, the types of buildings that are there, the materials that are used. Because it's not about trying to then create a pastiche of what's been done in the past, but it's like, how do you build on that and how do you make a positive addition? Because I think we all are accepting of and know that we need to continue to grow. We do need to provide housing and other uses throughout the country. And we also know from past experience that that has been done in a negative way or in a poor way. And I think that's where a lot of people's misconceptions with some of the stuff that we do might come from. That all development is bad, but I don't think that's the case. I think if you can really explain why you're doing, and actually that it's a good way of doing it, it's a positive thing for that community or creating a new community, then that's also something that's like really lovely about what we do when we do a lot of community engagement with certain projects, to be able to turn people's mindsets around. You know, NIMBYism is such a big thing in this country, and many people, you're not going to at all convince that what we're doing is good. But when you have those few glimmers of hope, when you can really explain that, you know, we are really trying to understand what is needed and listening to your views, that's really positive. So as well, yeah, so going back to, as well as having, you know, looking at context and historical assessments, we are always very driven by landscape in our projects, and we kind of work from the landscape up.
Yeah.
So using existing, you know, you might call them constraints. I don't think landscape is necessarily a constraint, but using that to help shape what we come forward. So the protection, enhancement of existing vegetation, obviously really thinking about landform, and the ecological merits that a site has, and enhancing that even further, which clearly is becoming a much bigger issue as well to tackle. But that's what really helps ground us in creating a place that then fits where it's being proposed.
Yeah.
But that all goes back to storytelling and perception. The history starts there. So often the history gives us the clues about where a place should go, but it also gives us that narrative and storytelling that we can talk to the local communities about. And likewise with the landscape and ecology and biodiversity, taking the cues from the existing place and protecting that character that's already there makes it a known kind of entity. Whereas if you were to wipe out all of the existing hedgerows on a site, you've taken away the character. And then people don't recognise it anymore. So that's why it's so important to keep all of that and to tell that story and build it up so that other people understand why we do the things that we do and what it means, to try and kind of relay some of the negative connotations that they have with development, which I think is a really interesting and difficult challenge for all of us in the profession to deal with. We've been looking recently at the difference between urban extensions and new settlements, and actually, is it better to look at new settlements in terms of perception and community engagement? Because there's a different kind of way that people take ownership of something that's down their street. Whereas if it's kind of a mile or 2 miles down the road, you don't necessarily have exactly the same connection with it because you don't see it every day.
Yeah.
And obviously there are many other benefits to creating new places because you're not sweating the assets of a place or increasing the traffic on somebody's street or on their front door. And actually it allows us to go much further in creating successful places. So that's kind of been a really interesting recent kind of endeavour for us that's very much been led by the pandemic. Because actually we have to start thinking about creating places now in a completely different way. That's a really interesting progression for everyone in the profession.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting time, and you know, people's values have changed so much on where they want to live and what they want places to be like. So how have you found that then? What have you found that people tend to chime more to an extension or a new settlement? Because I suppose, you know, you get people kind of looking at it like, oh, but it's part of our city or whatever, whereas opposed to it's their community over there, and they kind of want to be quite separate from it. Is that kind of a similar kind of response to what you've had, or is it people prefer to see something not where they are? They don't want something in their backyard, they want something
I don't think there's, I mean, I think people just overall don't like change, and that's completely understandable. Nobody really wants to see development anywhere.
That doesn't surprise me.
Until they kind of understand that, you know, their kids need somewhere to live, or they end up ultimately probably moving there themselves when they realise that it's not that bad. But most of the UK has been burnt by some of the development we've had in the 80s, 90s, noughties, and the bad kind of...
And I think the problem is, like, going back to this idea of that you're touching on whether extensions versus new settlements are nice or better, good, is that we've had so much piecemeal development. And the problem is, if you have 10 lots of 100 houses tacked on over time, which each in their own right don't provide enough weight to really deliver the other benefits that you need, the settlement has still grown by 1,000 new dwellings. Whereas if you'd have sort of done 1,000 dwellings, actually there would have been that kind of weight behind it to deliver more schools, probably doctor's surgery, all that sort of thing. So the piecemeal development, as much as there still obviously is a place for it and a need for it, because not all places do need to grow, and they're not going to all grow by an entire strategic extension or new settlement. But it's about trying to get people to understand that actually there is an alternative as well.
Yeah.
And we've also seen in settlements in Oxfordshire, as an example, where the local community has resisted development, they've ended up missing out on getting that community infrastructure because they're just pushing back. We don't want anything. So inevitably they've ended up with no facilities, but lots and lots of growth. And that's a real shame that that's happened. And actually there hasn't been a way to engage with people.
Yeah, it's true. It's a real challenge, isn't it? I mean, it's very difficult because I often think in that kind of similar kind of mindset of these large scale developments. But at the moment, I'm trying to build a house in Surrey, and we have an amazing plot of land which is already covered in structures and all of this type of thing, and it's a bit run down. It really could do with improving, and building a property on it. In our view, kind of makes sense because it's kind of enhancing the site. But you can also see it from kind of the planning side where they're kind of, because it's slightly outside the settlement, they're kind of like, we don't want any more development in the countryside. And I think that's one of the things I come across a lot now, is a lot of people are sort of saying, well, they're building 1,000 homes down the road or 100 homes down the road, but we've got this bit of land next to existing houses with all the utilities here, and actually we can't do anything with it. And I think that's a real challenge. It's interesting to see how the government's kind of responding, because they're putting a lot more effort into sort of self-builds and trying to relax some of the rules around that. And there are obviously places for that, but then again, you end up with that kind of piecemeal, infilly type situation, whereas in the countryside, maybe it's not so appropriate. I mean, I think it's appropriate in my case, but you can understand why they don't always look upon it so favourably. But I think that can also cause a lot of this kind of issue around, especially smaller communities, where you get a lot of pushback, because you get a lot of small communities that go, well, actually, we've got spaces here that are doable. Why are we not doing anything with them? Or why can't we? Yeah, something can be built down the road, and it's part of that. That's part of the kind of bigger discussion and kind of challenge that is kind of, there at the moment, I think.
I think that's a really difficult one to deal with, though, because often it will be an ownership issue, or for some reason it can't come forward. It's the same with kind of empty shops on the high street. Sometimes you can't contact the owners to fill the shops up. So it's way more complicated than people think it is. And people will always have that judgment that we should be doing brownfield first, we should fill the empty shops first. Sometimes it technically isn't possible to do that. And it's kind of having that open mind, but people will always push back about, on not here, no change. And there's a really interesting piece of work for us to do in the UK of changing that perception, and how we do that, I'm not entirely sure. But, thinking about the behavioural psychology of why people don't like change. What is that? I don't have the answer.